I'm really happy to present to you today a very outstanding researcher in the field of religion and science, or theology and science, Celia Deane-Drummond. She's a professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame since 2011. And before that, she was for 17 years with the total, I think, at Chester in England. She's from England. She got her PhD in plant physiology back in 1980, and then took some postdoctoral positions in Canada, and just in passing a postgraduate diploma in Christian Studies in Vancouver. Then she got a BA in theology at Trinity College in Bristol, and after that, well, there were a few other things, but then she got her PhD in theology at Manchester Victoria University, and wrote her thesis on the ecology in Jürgen Moltmann's theology.
Whose theology?
Jürgen Moltmann.
Okay. Did everybody get that?
No. One more time?
Okay.
Oh, people learn German. I'm sorry. Jürgen Moltmann.
Great Protestant theologian.
Important name in Protestant, well, in theology.
Jürgen Moltmann.
Yeah, Jürgen Moltmann, you got it.
Jürgen. Oh dear. Even I speak better.
Her research interests are really various. I mean, I know her through her work in theology and science, which is her major research work, but she's also interested in ethics, bioethics in general, though there she focuses on a number of issues. Environmental ethics primarily, but also genetics and ethics, animal ethics, global development, end-of-life questions, transhumanism. So a whole range of research topics. She's also interested in the constructive systematic theology informed by Roman Catholic contemporary and historical sources like Hans Urs von Balthasar and Thomas Aquinas. And that all translates into, at this state, if I counted correctly, 25 books, 123 papers, peer-reviewed articles and book chapters in theology. In biology, it's another 34. So, extraordinary amount of work. And really, it's really qualitatively extraordinary. So, I think you will enjoy this talk today. She will talk to us about freedom and agency in human beings and other animals. And the other animals here are really, that's an interesting point. That's actually where we have an overlapping interest. We're both interested in animals, and the question of free will, morality, and so forth. And the way that we will do this is Celia will give her a lecture for the first half. And please, if you have questions, keep them to questions of clarification. Then we take a 5 to 10 minute break, and then after the break we'll do a seminar, so to speak. That's when the handout comes in, and that's when we will discuss questions on free will. So without further ado, Celia Deane-Drummond.
Oops. Anyway, thank you very much for your generous introduction, and thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. And as Professor Putt suggested, this is going to fall into two sections. The first section will be more lecture style, and then we'll have maybe one or two questions after that, and then we're going to go into more depth in the seminar, and I'll be using a handout for that. Because some of the philosophical issues are quite difficult, and I thought it would be better to have more information in a handout for you, but I don't want you to read that yet because you might find it a bit off-putting, depending on whether you're philosophically inclined or not. So just leave that to one side for the moment and don't look at those notes yet at all. But before we start, I thought just to give you a sense of orientation, these are the key themes that I'm going to be addressing this evening. First of all, just to kind of warm us up, I'm going to think about a Bible story. Balaam, the ass and the angel. And for those of you who are not too familiar with the story, I'll just remind you of one or two of the features. Because I think it raises some really interesting questions about human and other animal agency. And then I'm going to look at image bearing, that is divine image bearing in humans and what the relationship with freedom. evolutionary theories about freedom and religion, and then animal freedom and agency. And where I use scare quotes, I mean that it's kind of freedom as we think of it, but it's not quite. So, and the biologists prefer to use the word agency. Human minds and levels of intention, that will become clearer as we go into that section, what that means. But it's about basically cognitive science. And then I'm going to be using Thomas Aquinas, because believe it or not, I think he's something of a genius and also perhaps prophetic in some of the ways he thought. And so we're going to be looking at some of that in terms of how he thought about human and animal minds. Of course, he didn't have the same scientific knowledge that we have today, so that we need to be aware of that. But before we finish, I'm also going to touch on Theodramatics, again this time drawing on Hansa von Balthasar. So in a sense what you're getting is some of my own particular interests in how to use some of these sources in relation to science, evolutionary science that is. And then a break followed by this seminar discussion where we can go into some of the philosophical issues in a little bit more detail. So I hope that just gives you a sort of map of where we're going this evening. Right, let's go to then the first story, Balaam and the ass, or the donkey. In the ancient Hebrew times, a donkey was considered something of a princely mount. That is, it was quite sophisticated to have a donkey. We tend to think of them as rather the lower end of the mounted species now, and so you might choose a thoroughbred or something like that instead. And apparently this particular donkey had carried Balaam all his life, so he's very familiar. There was a close relationship between the two. But in the Bible story, apparently the ass, or maybe we should give the ass a name, and call it something by name so that we know what we're talking about, as it were. So I'm going to call it Robert. So anyway, Robert saw the angel, but Balaam did not. And he kept on barring the path. So what happened is that Balaam was whipping whipping Robert all the time, and he just wouldn't move. He refused to move. Eventually, the angel moved into such a position where apparently Balaam scraped his foot against a wall. And at this point he got really annoyed with Robert. And you'll know why in a minute, why I've decided to give this particular animal a name. And then Robert spoke to Balaam and said, "What harm have I done you?" And apparently Balaam spoke back, not at all surprised that his donkey had spoken to him, and said, "You have been making a fool of me." So at that point, Yahweh intervenes, and he says that if Robert had failed to move in the way that the story tells, then almost certainly would have been. Then Balaam would almost certainly have been killed. So basically, Robert saved Balaam's life. At that point, Balaam admits that there's a sin involved, but not in relation to Robert. He just admits that he made a mistake. And so what I think this illustrates is a number of things. First of all, the close entanglement between humans and other creatures. In other words, we have a relationship with them. We have, if you like, depended on them for all sorts of things, in this case transport, all his life. We've built up a sense of who we are in relation to other creatures. But there was agency in both. That Robert made decisions to act in a certain way because of what he was confronted with. And so did Balaam. They both were making decisions. They were both making decisions in a particular way. They both had agency. Freedom, on the other hand, was confined more to the human in this case. But it also shows something about cooperation between the two and what that might mean. So let's move on to think about someone who's written about freedom in some more detail. And this is John Zizioulas, who's the ecumenical, he was involved with the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople. He was a professor at Glasgow University at one time, but then he decided to call himself Zizioulas. He was called John Zizioulas, but he also just gave himself another name in relation to his title as an Orthodox priest. And he says this, he says that freedom is the distinctive mark of the human, and it's through freedom that we become the image of God. And that's more so than other possible characteristics that we might have. And why does he say this? Why is it freedom that is the mark of the human? And he says this because whatever involves succumbing to the given, this man has in common with the animals. Whatever is free from it constitutes a sign of the presence of the human. And that's a very interesting thing, I think, to think about. Because the reason he says this is that what is found in God and not in the rest of creation is freedom. And therefore, to be in the image of God, we must have freedom. He's not talking about free choice here. In other words, I decide to come to this lecture this evening and accept the invitation, generous as it is, to come over to here from Indiana. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about creativity in obedience to God. So, in other words, our sense of free, what freedom means, according to John Zizioulas, is creativity in obedience to God. Now, we might say, well, he's probably right that freedom isn't as simple as simply free choice, but on the other hand, do animals succumb to the given in the way he suggested here? We might have a bit of a problem with that. Certainly in the case of Balaam, he wasn't simply succumbing to the given in any sort of way. In fact, if anything, he was far more responsive to the divine than Balaam was. So you could say, well, it's not just responding to what's out there and not thinking or not having any sense of agency, something else. But are we wishful thinking? Are we engaging in wishful thinking? Perhaps this story of Balaam and Robert, or the ass if you prefer, is an allegory of something else, an allegory about human obedience and our resistance to obeying God. So these are a number of questions that come to the surface when we think about this. But I think we can agree that freedom also brings the possibility of sin. And so freedom leads to a tragic situation, as it were, where our abuse of freedom is the way we absolutize it. We try to reach out for an absolute freedom, but then that leads to sin, because humans are finite. So we cannot reach the kind of freedom that is divine. We absolutize it, and that then leads to sin. And that's how he explains, as it were, the origin of sin story that we were very familiar with in the book of Genesis. At the same time, I think we need to start asking questions about the human and other animal boundary that he presupposes in this. So, is human behaviour really free, or is it in some sense constrained by evolution? So how far is he correct to assume that we have this kind of freedom? There's a possibility then of a moral agency in humans where freedom is missing. So can such an agent show virtues or not, or maybe even vices? So what can we distinguish then the kind of cooperation that we find in ants and the more complex social cooperation that we find in humans? Because if we see an ant colony, for example, we see hyper-sociality, but it's not. They don't display the kind of freedom that we're thinking about when we think about human freedom. But perhaps when we start thinking about higher social animals, some other issues start coming to the surface, and maybe they do have some sort of agency. But then we look in the other direction, from the evolutionary direction, and in this case, we think, well, are we really as free as all that? So in other words, we're turning the lens, we're not asking, are other animals free like us? We're asking, are we like other animals, simply responding to something we cannot control? So there are two ways of breaking down the differences between humans and other animals. One is to say that humans are actually behaving like animals much of the time. In other words, we're presupposing that they don't have any kind of agency. And the other is to say, well, perhaps other animals in their more sophisticated variants, in social animals, perhaps they have some sort of agency that's more similar to humans. So it's this boundary issue that I think is very, very interesting. So how far are humans free or constrained by their biology? And I think the evolution of religion is a good example of trying to think about that questions around freedom, because it raises very important questions about who we are in relation to other animals, but also how we are distinctive. And so I'm going to use religious belief as a sort of case study in thinking about questions about freedom. So we're now going to move to debates in the evolution of religious capacity. Now certainly, what I'm going to run through now is the various explanations of where religion comes from an evolutionary science point of view. So if you just bracket off for the moment some of the theological issues to do with freedom and examples of freedom as an example of how we are in the image of God, what I want us to do now is to turn to the evolutionary science and think, well, what does the science say about how humans act and how humans are religious in particular? Because they haven't, most scientists, when they're thinking about this area, believe that freedom is a kind of illusion. So if we're going to get to something more concrete that scientists discuss, then they'll talk about religion. So you can't say that religion is an illusion, there's too much about. So in order to try and explain religion, we have to, according to a scientist, we have to have various theories of where that religion has come from. And so these are the different theories. First of all, it could be a direct or indirect adaptation. So what do I mean? Direct adaptation means that it's a selective advantage to have a particular capacity, in this case, religious belief. So if you have religious belief, you're that much more likely to survive and have offspring compared to others. So it's that's what it means by selective advantage. On the other hand, it could be indirect. It could be an indirect. In other words, it might be that you have a different kind of mental capacity that's an advantage in evolutionary terms. But along with that different kind of mental capacity comes a propensity to believe in God. So therefore, it's an indirect adaptation. If we ask these kinds of questions, we could say, well, does anything like it appear in primates, other primates? Or is language a prerequisite? Now, we need to be careful here, because if you go back into evolutionary history, we don't just come from the chimpanzees in a linear sense. But there's a common ancestor. Way, way back, millions of years ago, there was a common ancestor of both humans and other primates that we see around us today. And we could, but in order to try and work out whether there's anything like this in the evolutionary history, can we find anything to do with this in other primates or not? Certainly you won't get organised religion, that would be nonsense, and I'm not trying to suggest that. But there might be some sort of religious sensibility, and certainly in the story of Balaam and Robert, or Balaam and the ass if you prefer, there was something about that sensitivity of that animal to spiritual agency. And so something was going on there. So it's written into the core text of the Bible. So maybe that's a possibility. If that's the case, it could be either direct or indirect. So you could see it as a direct or indirect adaptation. But that's not the only scientific account it could just be, this is religion, it could just be adaptive behaviour to cultural demands. And so has no evolutionary significance whatsoever. So the evolutionary story is simply a myth. So we need to be careful about this, because you tend to think of evolutionary biologists as wanting to explain everything, freedom, religion, everything, according to evolution. But there are a fraction of scientists who will say, well, actually, it's simply a cultural demands, and it doesn't really have any direct evolutionary significance in the way that we can measure. And so it might just be a local adaptation. And so in this sense, it poses no pressure on understanding, religious understanding of what religion is about, and no pressure on freedom for that matter, because you could say the same thing about freedom, or the capacity for freedom. And then finally, there are difficulties really here in thinking about the relationship between nature and nurture. So nurture is the development of an individual in cultural terms. Nurture is about people bringing up their children and so on. But how much is someone's belief just a matter of nurture, and how much is nature? So that is an ongoing debate, or maybe the two are kind of muddled up and mixed up together. And one of the difficulties that scientists have is that very often you will have a particular genetic trait, but it's very plastic in the way it responds. So in some individuals you might have this characteristic showing up, but in other cases, in other circumstances, this characteristic wouldn't show up. And that's a sort of a plastic response. So that flexibility in the way things are expressed means that it's sometimes very difficult to measure some of these things. And certainly with complex characteristics such as religion, it becomes even more difficult. And so there is a debate going on amongst many scientists about how far there's direct or indirect adaptation, or maybe it's simply adaptive, or maybe it's indirect, and so on. So what I'm trying to introduce you to is the idea of debates even within the science. So there's not a cut and fast scientific account of this particular issue. On the other hand, many evolutionary biologists believe that freedom or even purpose in human life is an illusion put there in order to act as an advantage in evolutionary terms. And we'll come on to some of the philosophical issues around this in the second half. And what I want to do now is to say, well, okay, let's leave again these scientific debates to one side for the moment, and think about other animals and whether they might possess some form of freedom or not. And for this, I'm going to turn to a book that's become quite well known amongst postmodern scholars and others. Jacques Derrida, who's a postmodern scholar, and he wrote quite a famous book called The Animal That Therefore I Am, Following. Sometimes the following gets missed off. And really, he wasn't alone in putting animals back on the agenda. Suddenly they became fashionable in literary discourse and in philosophical discourse. So we have this. So alongside these evolutionary explanations going on by evolutionary biologists, you have a stream of literature coming out about other animals and the fascination, the thinking about other animals in relation to who we are as humans. And he tells the story something like this, that he met his cat while he was in the bathroom, and he was stark naked at the time, and he suddenly felt embarrassed, ashamed of being in front of his cat. And he asked himself, well, why on earth do I feel ashamed? Because, of course, this cat can't have any sense that I'm naked, so why am I embarrassed in this way? Is this an encounter with a subject or not? And as a result of that, he went into some detail into this entanglement between humans and other animals, and how this shifts our own understanding of who we are as agents as a result of thinking about our relationship with other animals. And of course, in this case, we could criticise him because the way he treats the cat in his particular story isn't necessarily the way a cat will really think, as it were, from a biologist's point of view. So you have a tension here between a biologist wanting to think more carefully about a cat mind, as it were, and then this philosopher coming in and talking about this particular experience with a cat, which has sort of thrown off his own understanding of who we are as humans, and it sort of put him on a thread or a train of deconstructing our understanding of who we are as human beings. So, and that's why he's called a post-human writer, because the traditional understanding of the human is somehow unsettled by these sort of questions and encounters. So where do we go from here? Well, we can suggest first of all that the biologists use the term agency and not simply freedom. So the biologists will resist using anything like freedom in their language about other animals, even the most sophisticated primates or alloprimates. But we need to also consider the more popular view that animals are just driven by instinct. And I would say that this was really what John Zizioulas was alluding to. That is some sort of instinct, which means that their basic desires for food, sex, predation, avoidance, and that kind of thing is all that really goes on in an animal mind. And if we're going to be like animals, then this is what controls human behaviour, as it were. But that's a very popular view. Are animals really like that or not? Or are there other things that are going on? So we need to ask ourselves, are humans more like other animals, or are other animals more like humans? So there's a mix, there's beginning to be a sense of a mixture between the two. And I think this is very important for thinking about freedom and agency, because it then starts to question our whole understanding of what it means to be a human agent. And for that we need to then start thinking more clearly about other animal minds. So, because if animals are really like us, how do we know how they think? And if we're going to research into that, we really have to look into other animal minds, as well as human psychology. So we have to start doing a bit of animal psychology as well. And many of the people working in evolutionary studies will look at other animals as an example of how they we'll look at other animals as to try and work out both how we think and also how they think. In other words, the questions around human and other animal minds are completely fascinating. When we think of ourselves here, how can we tell the intention of a subject? Now, one of the things, if I'd got here a bit earlier, and there were various reasons why I didn't, which I'm not going to go into, I was thinking about showing you a short video film of a paramecium, which is a small organism, microorganism, that has a very long flagella, and as a biologist I used to be fascinated by paramecia. Paramecia have a way of getting to their food source, which is on a petri dish or somewhere else. And you could think to yourself, well, it's found its way there. Well, does it have freedom in doing that? Well, no, it probably doesn't. Does it have agency? Of a sort, but not the kind of agency we're interested in, which is a more kind of free agency. It certainly doesn't have any sort of sophisticated cognition, but it still gets there. There's still something going on in there. In order to try and unpack this a little bit more, we have to draw on levels of intention, and I'm just going to explain what that is. If you believe there's an outside world out there, which paramecia cannot do, but if you start to believe there is an outside world out there, you have what's called a first level of intention. And certainly the encounter between a dog and a cat is fairly non-controversial. That if we encounter a dog or a cat, they do believe in the outside world. I mean, anyone who's had any experience with pets will know that's the case. On the other hand, what about belief in what the other is thinking? That is the second level of intention. And certainly in the case of Balaam and Robert, their level seems to have been reached. He knew perfectly well what his master was thinking about, but at the same time he refused because there was another agent in the room, in this case an angel. Humans aged around 4 or 5 seem to have that capacity. Of course, you could say, well, can dogs really know what I'm thinking, or are they somehow primed to react in certain ways because they see certain cues, like I get out a dog biscuit, and that follows if they do certain things. It does take a lot of serious ethological work to really work out what's going on in animal minds. I think we can sometimes draw conclusions which are false from observation of our pets, although it's very tempting to do so. But at the same time, we can also treat those animals as if they're just automata and not necessarily give them the benefit of the doubt. So we need to be careful on both fronts. If we go up to another level, belief that the other is thinking about something or someone else, that's the third level of intention. So if I think you're thinking about when you're going to go to bed tonight or what you have for dinner, then I'm automatically approaching the issue from a third level of intention. And so it goes on, up to a certain limit of a fifth level. And the person who has done most work on this is someone called Robin Dunbar, who's he's a psychologist at Oxford University, although he hasn't always worked at Oxford, but he is there now. And he's done some very interesting research on this fourth and fifth levels, because he says this. He says that if we are going up to the fourth and fifth levels of intentions, it's then that we start to be able to tell stories and start to also to be able to have religious beliefs. You have to have these levels of intention in order to be able to tell stories about other things, and also to be able to have a sophisticated sense of religion. Some of the work he's done on correlating brain size with group size is controversial, but I think his work on levels of intention is really pretty solid. And he also gives a very interesting example from this, because he says this. He says that Shakespeare was able to think to the sixth level of intention. And the reason he was able to think to that level was because he writes about actors and so on in the fifth level, and you can't think about someone in the fifth level unless you can think to the sixth level, if that makes sense. And so a really great drama is about sixth level of intention. And so he gives this example of Othello. And to make this a little bit more real, I'm going to explain something. You may know the story really well already, but I'll assume you don't know the story. So in Othello, Iago intends that Othello imagines that Desdemona is in love with Cassio. That takes 4 levels of intention, because at each step that you make about the other person thinking about someone else is 1 level. Okay, so if I think about the outside world, that's 1 level, but if I think you're thinking about something, that goes up to 2 levels, and so on and so forth. So I'll just say that again. Iago intends that Othello imagines Desdemona is in love with Cassio. That's 4 levels. But the really interesting part comes when Iago persuades Othello that Cassio reciprocates the feelings. And that is 5 levels of intention. And that 5th level of intention is also crucial for religious religion, the 4th and the 5th level. At the 4th level of intention, we have a social religion, where divine and human are involved together, you may get some intervention from one or the other, certainly from the divine. So it's a kind of social religion where the beliefs are accepted by the group as a whole. But it takes a 5th level of intention to go up a notch, and where we have free acceptance as individuals of that claim of a community. So our free acceptance of the claims of a community to have a religious belief takes a 5th level of intention. And this is something that Robin Dunbar suggests. So freedom then is essential to have this more free assent to this particular belief. you can have a more, I don't want to call it primitive, you can have a more basic religious belief just with 3 levels of intention. So you are thinking about God requires 3 levels of intention, and certainly young children will have that kind of level of intention. The third order would also include perhaps an emotional response to the divine. So you could say that other animals could be in this third order, because certainly there are some animals that can think up to that third level, and that's where they get stuck. So you can imagine at least some sort of sensitivity to religious belief at that stage, but not much more than that. So sensitivity to the divine, perhaps an emotional response to the divine, but certainly not the kind of free assent or even the social assent that we get in the 4th and the 5th levels. The problem comes, of course, when we think about some of the cultural assumptions that we have about other animals and their relationship to humans. Often have been thought of in human history as simply means to human ends. And so if we're going to do any kind of comparison, we have to bear in mind some of these ethical questions as well, some of the ethical issues. And Thomas Aquinas does not have a very good press when it comes to thinking about animals. He saw them largely as means to human ends. And so there's a mixture in his work. And in this sense, he saw animals as simply tools then for human use. And many of the animal rights campaigners, and even some of the Christian ones, have seen him as something of the bête noire of the theological world. That is the black sheep, so just to excuse the pun. So how do we deal with this? Well, actually, he's actually more interesting than it seems at first sight. He's more interesting than it seems, because he also believed that other animals had an estimative sense and a certain type of prudence. So he actually believed that other animal minds could make a discerning choice of prudence, as well as have a form of rationality and estimative sense, in a way which was surprisingly sophisticated, considering he didn't know anything about animal behaviour or ethology. He just did it probably because Albertus Magnus was one of his teachers, or his main teacher, and he wrote not a Summa Theologica, he wrote a Summa Zoologica. And so Aquinas was having all this input from his teacher. Everybody's influenced by some of their teachers, or they should be, a little bit influenced. But Aquinas was influenced by Albertus Magnus, and he was fascinated by other animals. So he couldn't really go away and not do anything on them at all. I mean, he took up the cultural assumption that they were tools for human use. But when it came to thinking about other animal minds, he had this very interesting idea of an estimative sense, as well as I said, a type of prudence. And he believed that other animals had an inner judgment that was useful. So they weren't simply automata that kind of responded to kind of blind instinct. And Descartes is a philosopher you may have heard of in this course, but Descartes just thought that, who came much later than Aquinas, he thought that animals were simply machines that just responded to things mechanically. And now, Aquinas didn't think like that at all. He didn't think they were machines at all. He thought they were much more sophisticated than that. You might say, well, why on earth did you think they were just tools for human use? Well, I think there was a disjunction there between a cultural presupposition that they should be used as tools and his own thinking that actually took him in another direction completely. He also believed that humans were distinct in their abilities to have abstract thoughts and make universals. The philosophy that we're doing in the second half of today is a distinctly human ability. You can't expect chimpanzees to start thinking about the various philosophical theories that we're going to be discussing. It would be ridiculous to think that. So there is something different about the way human minds think compared to other animals. At the same time, they do. There is a certain analogy in some respects. when we come to think about the soul, the particular soul, for example, did Aquinas follow Plato or Aristotle? Now that is quite important, because Plato thought there was a soul even before someone was born, that was out there somehow in the ether, and suddenly the soul came in to this matter, and then we had the person. Whereas Aristotle thought more that ensoulment happened gradually during somebody's life, and there was a plant soul and an animal soul and a human reasonable soul, and they were like in a nested kind of hierarchy. And that is more similar to the kind of ensoulment that Aquinas ended up adopting. So he didn't think of a pre-existent soul, but he did think of some sort of emergent soul, and he believed that that soul persisted after death, which is very interesting. So he did think there was an animal soul and a plant soul and a human soul, but he talked about reasonable soul. So depending on what he knew about other animal minds, he could have been pushed a little bit to go with perhaps the afterlife for other animals, although he never really went down that route. So his understanding of the reasonableness in other animals wasn't sufficient for him to think there was persistence. At the same time, he did think there was a more of a blurred boundary. And this idea of humans as the only ones with this kind of abstract thought is actually very similar to many anthropologists today, such as Terence Deacon, for example, who talks about the symbolic species. Humans are the symbolic species, and they're symbolic, that is, they're able to symbolize in particular ways. But at the same time, we can see that there are other animals that have elements of that ability to symbolize. They have iconic and semiotic skills, which I won't go into here because it involves another philosopher called Charles Peirce. But basically, symbolism doesn't suddenly appear out of nowhere, as it were, with humans. There's something going on in the evolutionary history until it flowers into this symbolic capacity. Yes, humans are distinct, but it's a distinctiveness wrought of these evolutionary processes. Now you could say, well, does that mean that other animals should bear the image of God, like humans, if there are these sort of blurred boundaries, as it were? But in my own reading of this, I draw back from that speculation, and the reason is this. There is another language that Aquinas uses called likeness. Animals are in the likeness of God. And that, I think, is sufficient to give other animals an affirmation of who they are in their own agency and identity without confusing humans and other animals. I know that I've had discussions with Charles Camozzi and some other Catholic scholars about this. He prefers to push for animal image bearing. I've toyed with the idea myself, but I think in the end, if we look at Aquinas' understanding of image bearing, even though he says it's unique to humans because of our reason, if you push him a bit further, those whose reason is completely gone or impaired still bear the image, even in Aquinas. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is because he doesn't think the image is simply related to reason. There are other issues going on to do with the grace of God. So in other words, God's grace comes into the human person, and that, as it were, allows them to bear the image in a particular way, even though it's our reason, as it were, that opens us up to that kind of receptivity to God. And so for Aquinas, he places humans in between other animals and angels in the scheme of things. And yet, in human beings, we have the material expression of that image bearing in a way that angels do not. So, what do we do with all these different ideas? How can we possibly connect an evolutionary debates about freedom, about religion, with some of these theological ideas about other animals and image bearing? And for that, I want us to take us on another. Whoops, I've done that. Another step, and that is, excuse me, Theodramatics. Now, Hans Urs von Balthasar isn't known for thinking about other animals. So why use him? Well, I'm drawing on him for the simple reason is that I think the idea of Theodramatics is really fascinating. But just to give you a sort of very potted summary of what that means in a very fairly brief manner, but it gives you a picture of what he's talking about. There are 5 volumes of this Theodrama that follow on from 10 volumes of his Glory of the Lord, his Theological Aesthetics. So I don't suggest any of you read any of this, except to say that you might want to touch on this one, volume 3, if you become really interested, or maybe just read some of the summaries I've done in my own papers, and then go from there. Because Theodrama is about our history in accordance with God's intentions. So it's really a theology of human history in relation to the future, in relation to the present. But at the same time, the core act in the drama is the coming of Jesus Christ. So that's the central act in the drama, around which every other drama is orientated, if it's going to be a Christian theodrama. So that's the second point. The third point is that why I call it drama and not just story or narrative. There's a reason for this, and the reason is that the epic, or the grand narrative as it were, presupposes a story which has a certain result at the end that feels a little bit like fatalism. Strong evolutionary accounts, including Darwin's theory of evolution, is an epic. Many other people use epics all the time, including some accounts of theology. An epic is where you stand outside what is going on and describe what is happening in a fairly broad brush stroke manner, without necessarily looking into some of the details. You don't look at the drama, the internal drama of what's going on, but it's a little bit like the new creation story, Gaia's theory of global the Earth's origin, and so on. All these are grand narratives, and you may have heard some of these already from some of the other lecturers. But what I'm trying to suggest to you today is that actually an epic gets us so far, but doesn't necessarily get us down to what I think are the really interesting details. And to do that, we need a drama, because the drama can link the existential, what's going on in my inner life, our inner sense of self, with the story. It'll link it because we are no longer simply observers, observing an epic out there, this story going on out there. We have become involved as participants. We are in this drama together, whether we like it or not. You're part of this drama just by listening to me, in a manner of speaking. So, think about the key places in the Bible where the drama is going on. Of course, there's a drama of Christ coming, but also Mary. Her yes could have been no. That may seem as a shock to you, but I'm saying that this is a real drama going on, a real decision of yes or no, a real decision of Peter to deny Jesus, a real decision of him to repent subsequently, a real decision of Christ to take the cup in the Garden of Gethsemane. It wasn't a preordained event in which everything would have just happened the way it is, regardless of what the decisions that were made. These were particular decisions made in a particular way. They were dramatic decisions. There was a kairos moment, a moment of history which is particularly significant in a religious sense. And so the radically new act, as it were, of God becoming human in the person of Christ was also an act in the drama. So God, as it were, is also an agent in this process. Now, can we think of other animals being involved in this sort of thing or not? And I would say that we have to take into account animal minds. We cannot presuppose that they have any sort of abstract thought or any sort of theodramatic instincts, or like, in other words, they cannot tell the story the way I'm telling the story, but they can still be involved in the story. They're not simply a stage, they're not simply this room with seats on which we sit, as it were, and use them for our own purposes. Other animals are moving around, they are doing things in relationship with us in a way that changes the shape of that story. We can't sort of think that they're just kind of a blank sheet. But unfortunately, many theologians, including famous ones like Karl Barth and even Balthasar, who was influenced by Karl Barth, believe that the creation and the environment were simply stages on which humans acted. There's much more going on than that. It's much more interesting and much more complicated. So even going back to Balaam and the donkey will remind us that it's more complicated than that. And in a sense, the clock has given me my cue, in a sense, to wrap this up, because I'm nearly finished. In image bearing, then, the kind of image bearing I'm suggesting to you makes sense, is about being human in relation as performers, with all due humility about what that might entail. Because in our performance, sometimes maybe it's other animals that get it and we don't. Maybe they have a particular instinct and we don't have that. And so the extent to which other animals might be moral or not would be the subject of another lecture, and I can certainly talk about that in the discussion. But what I'm trying to press today is there are ways of drawing on other animal evolutionary ideas, and I could go into a great deal more detail about how this Theodramatics is an analogy of new evolutionary theories that are coming to the surface now to do with niche construction. And that's, again, getting a little bit too complicated for a lecture on freedom, so I'm happy to do that. But what I'm saying is that there are ways of weaving in humans and other animals together in the theological account in a way that takes account of the science of what's going on, other animal minds. It also takes into account some of the evolutionary stories, but doesn't want to reduce it to those stories. It resists the idea that religion is simply an evolutionary event, and that's all there is to say about it. Yes, there might be capacities that we have, our minds gradually became more sophisticated, capacities that we have in order to allow us to believe, but there's something else going on when we think about religion that cannot, it escapes to some extent the kind of explanation that evolutionary scientists give it. And so we can draw on that evolutionary science, but we shouldn't just shrink the religious experience or the theological discussion simply to that kind of narrative, which is, as I say, a grand narrative, because it doesn't necessarily allow for something else. So that's, again, all I wanted to say for this part. What we're going to do next is this. But before we do that, go into some of these things in more detail, I'm going to open up the floor for any questions or a clarification. I have thrown up at you a lot today. There may be things that you want to talk about before we have a short break and then move into some of these more philosophical debates and questions.
Could you just explain the difference between image and likeness? Because I'd always had them as synonyms in my head, and also
Okay.
it's just helpful. in general.
Okay, right, that's a really excellent question. Thank you. Yeah, what I'm doing here is I'm using Thomas Aquinas' distinction. But what's really fascinating is he had two meanings of likeness. So there was the kind of likeness that other animals have, which is common to us as well. But the image is uniquely human. But in making the image, he also had a graded image of God. So unfortunately, he thought that women had less of an image of God in them compared to men. Well, of course, that's not right. I can't expect him to think that. But he did that on the basis of not just what he thought was their lesser rationality, but he also thought that that the extent to which they could receive the grace of God was different. But what he did believe was that eventually certain men could become in the likeness of God, in a superlative kind of way. So there was two kinds of likenesses. There was the likeness of we shared in common with animals, but there was also the likeness when we come very close to being like angels. So it is messy in some ways, that term, and in a way I'm using it deliberately because I think there's a kind of naturalness to other animals in their opacity to the divine. In a sense, it's not as complicated as it is with humans who have the capacity to sin. So you could say that they are more transparent to the divine compared to humans in some respects. Although, of course, there are also, I mean, this is another lecture altogether, but there are also tendencies for ill in other animals as well. You could call it a form of sin if you want. So I don't think that the fall happened. What happened in the account of the narrative about the fall was then spread into all the rest of the creation. I think there was a build-up to that happening in other animals, but there wasn't a self-conscious agency in the way that we have in humans. So the likeness is there, but it's not a conscious likeness. So it's not in a sense we're self-consciously in the likeness of God in the way that other animals are not. But there is a likeness there. There's a mirror there. There's a sense in which the whole of creation reflects something of the divine. So he believed that the whole of the natural world it was in the imago Trinitatis. It's the image of the Trinity. So we're not, and in a sense this reflects also some perhaps Ignatian spirituality. Christ is in all things. So there is a sense in which there's a reflection of God in all things, and that's what Aquinas believed. But he believed that it was the deepest form of reflection was in the image of God. But the image of God in humans isn't the same as the image of God in Christ. So he believed that the image of God that we have in Christ is like the relationship between Father and Son. Well, it is Father and Son in a sense, but the difference is if you see the Son stamped, the image of the Son stamped onto a coin, that's the kind of image that we have. It's a copy of the image, whereas Christ is the real image. So if you look to Christ, Christ reflects the kind of image, the ultimate image towards which all humans aspire, is the image of God in Christ. But that's not the kind of aspiration of animals, because animals cannot grow in the spiritual life in that kind of way. But they can be receptive to the divine, and they can, I think, show something of the likeness of God from the very fact that they're created and all of creation is good. But we need to, again, be realistic about what I would call the shadow side of creation as well, and not make it too romantic, or think that everything that we see in the natural world is just a giant reflectivity of God and nothing else. There are shadow sides there too, and again, that's another whole discussion of theodicy, so which I could answer about, but it's not quite on the topic of freedom, so, which I've been asked to speak on today, but it's a good question. Yeah.
You gave a brief definition of freedom as the mark of the human. Could you just differentiate that between that and free will for us?
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about that in the next in the seminar session, where we'll go into the different aspects of freedom, free will, and so on. If you still think that it's not clear, then we can come back to that again during the seminar. But if I just want to hold off on that particular question for the moment, because I think it will be answered shortly, if that's okay. Yeah.
Will you also be addressing freedom in the sense of creativity and obedience to God, and what that means and what that looks like?
No, I'm not going to do that, because that's really John Zizioulas' idea. But I think it's an interesting idea.
Okay.
We will be looking at the philosophical theories behind free will, and then we can come back to that question again as to where would that image of freedom fit into some of these philosophical debates, because I think one of the problems is that there is theological reasoning about freedom, and it doesn't always marry up with the philosophical reasoning. So we will look at the philosophical reasoning, and then we can have a discussion about how do you bring these two things together, which is a really interesting question. But if we can do that when we look at the philosophy first, and then we can come back to that again, I think it will probably work better. But I think you put your finger on something very important by identifying that, because I think the creativity, I think, mirrors a little bit what I'm trying to say with theodrama, because theodrama is a creative exercise in the sense that we are acting out, as it were, the theodrama that's put in, at least the shape or broad shape of it is put there by God. So there's an obedient, when we act in obedience to God, then we are displaying the kind of freedom that is most compatible with the theodrama going the way that it was intended to go, as it were. So there's always the possibility of tragic in theodrama. There's a possibility of, Mary could have said no, and then what would have happened then? Who knows? I don't know what would have happened, but I'm just saying that there's with freedom comes the possibility of something else. What we have to decide is whether the philosophical theories give an adequate explanation of some of that, or whether they are in some sense wanting. Now, I'm not sure what the answer to that is yet, so I'm hoping that you will help me think through this yourself, because I think it's a difficult question, and I'm not sure whether... I think that writers like John Zizioulas, or the Bishop of Pergamon, the names come back to me now, I've momentarily forgot what he called himself in the Orthodox Church, but he doesn't take into account these kind of philosophies at all. And yet I think we're called upon to think philosophically sometimes and think about what it might mean. But I'll just take maybe one or two more questions and maybe we should... Yeah.
This is kind of a bit off topic, but I, in listening to the lecture, noticed a lot of corollaries between the questions of like agency and questions in artificial intelligence and kind of like the limits of the Turing test. Would you or perhaps Paul or Oliver know of any good authors to refer me to possibly go more into the questions of this applied to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean that's
I certainly can give you some names there. There are some people who work on that question, especially when also in relation to theology. So can't think of. I know that.
I can email you
the name, but
after.
yes, please do. Yeah, I can point you at some literature there.
Thanks.
yes, yeah. I mean Fraser Watts has done a little bit
Fraser
of
Watts
work on that kind of area, and so's
Sorry, what the
Nancy.
first name? I think
Fraser Watts, and then I think it's Nancy Watts. So
Murphy?
no, not Murphy. It's another one. Hertzfield or something. I'm trying to think of.
No, not Nancy. It's Hertzfeld.
Hertzfeld. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll come back to me.
We had her in-
Sorry,
Yeah.
Thank you.
it's probably jet lag kicking in. or something.
Send me an email and I'll
Yeah.
Noreen Hertzfeld.
Noreen Hertzfeld, that's it. I knew it began with N.
But,
So yeah, she's
I'll-
done quite a lot of work on that
Send
kind
you
of
some stuff there, yeah.
area. So yes, but it's not something I've written on myself actually. That kind of, but it is. The transhumanism is something I'm very interested in, which is another issue as well. Perhaps time for one more. Any more hands? Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Since Aquinas was Aristotelian and felt that the soul was not separate from the body, it was the form of the body, to what extent? And then he said after death, we still have a relationship to the body. So I'm just curious, since we're talking about animals, if we have this tripartite soul, did he believe that we eventually lose the animal soul, or was the animal soul brought up into, since the body is part of the animal nature, how do you see that? And it seems to perdure after death also in his mind, the relationship with the body.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great puzzles that I don't think is really properly discussed or explained. Because when he talked about the persistence after death, it seems that it seems like he did somehow presuppose some sort of separation, but at the same time he was still strictly Aristotelian. So
Right.
so there's a bit of a tension there, I think. But he never talked about other animals having any of that kind of persistence. So it was the rational soul that persisted rather than the animal soul and the plant soul. And,
So there's no animal soul remaining after.
well, that's what he said, although I think there's something disjunctive about that. So I don't think it quite works with the rest of his understanding of ontology. So there's if you like, there are tensions in his thought about using other animals as means to an end, as compared to his ontology, which suggested a much more fluid understanding of other animals compared to humans. And the same sort of tension exists again after death. So it's almost like he had the official teaching of the church that he was wrestling with in relation to some of these other ideas, and he got kind of stuck at certain point. I don't know, I mean, I'm just speculating, but there are sort of what I would call disjunctions in his thought on that.
Can't that be resolved to the primary matter? It's basically, I mean, it's not so much that it's the relationship to the physical body as much as the primary matter as the possibility of being.
Yeah, yeah.
And the primary matter is not physical. The
No.
primary matter is a metaphysical
No, I mean, it's an
concept,
immaterial, but
but not the soul.
yeah,
That's
but
not the informal principle.
there's an immateriality about reason that he came to, but also there was an immateriality about the will as well. But of course we could say, well, that was a mistake, because we know that both the reason and the will require a materiality to it. So in other words, there are slight muddles there in terms of when we come to modern cognitive science and how that might work. So, but on the other hand, you couldn't necessarily expect him to. You can see how he solved the problem himself within his own scheme, but you can't necessarily expect him to have known some of these other things.
Most of medieval medicine felt that the soul, everybody had to accept the soul as part of the body. So there was that link between, even in medicine,
Yeah.
between the soul and the body.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about the after death, what I was suggesting was that he was leaning more towards an Aristotelian view rather than a Platonic view.
Right.
Certainly, the substance of his thought was a unified sense of the ensoulment of the body. So it wasn't a split in any sense
Right.
there at all. It was only after death that it started to become more immaterial. But then his understanding of being, like I said, was a strong sense of the divine in that sustaining the whole of being. So creatio ex nihilo, so creation out of nothing, was the primary sense of what creation was about. So he distinguished between creation and nature, and in that sense, after death, it was the created world that was important. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, I think he believed the soul was going to be reunited to the body at the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he certainly did that. It's really what happened immediately after death is the possibility.
Right.
You could say, well, maybe an intermediate state in the way that the Anglicans thought of it, who knows. Maybe it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, we do have this holistic understanding.
Right.
Yeah, I think we need to take a
Thank you
break.
very much. We'll take a break, come back.